talking about the role of education, the role that education has in shaping our institutions, and not only the institutions, but us as humans. As during over a year, we started a process, an open and very candid conversation with cultural leaders, curators, artists, trying to get and gather information to help us to refine and reimagine the future of the ArtCenter South Florida. We do think that being in a constant mode of evaluation and reassessing what we are doing is the only way to move forward. We are committed to use our knowledge, our lessons learned, to overcome obstacles and share it with all for the advancement and providing positive change for our world, for our field, and for the world.
Talking about kind of where the students are at vis-a-vis the university, because that's the beginning of my first question, and this is kind of broadened for any of the panelists to begin to respond to. But I noticed, I picked up a thread of, this identification of certain sort of failures in traditional systems of education, of university education, for instance, or community service, and the impulse to work outside of them or even to circumvent them. My question is, how does your organization, or how do you think about, how do you then fit into the system once you've established your own model that maybe does one of these things? How then do you see yourself within the system after that, or like reapplying to it?
I don't really see ArtCenter's programs necessarily outside of those things, right? Or really kind of maybe even crashing up so distinctly, but about creating maybe a new option. So in rethinking what we can do with institutions, right? Which we are, just by the pure nature of the flexibility and malleability that the institution is in right now. I think we sort of present another option within this particular community alongside others. And maybe in reflecting upon this, 5 years from now, you say, okay, these things don't work, these things did work, and the institution needs to change toward these other things. But I think at the core of your question, in some ways, there is a general belief that the way that we imagine this institution can be reimagined based in a responsive manner towards those needs and where it stands within this community. But I think it stands as a viable other option.
Mm-hmm. We can add that obviously it's an incredible, did I turn this off? An incredible range of obviously methodologies, interventions, ways of organizing ourselves, bottom-up, top-down, etc. In offering really very different vantage points about this relationship between institutions and communities in that sense. From our part, I think, and I'm speaking for both of us as partners in this project, I think the position we've taken is to really engage institutions. I mean, we would truly believe in an institutional dimension. In fact, we want to make institutions accountable, as Fauna mentioned earlier, primarily at a time when public imagination continues to be eroded. Public infrastructure, public education. And I think the possibility of rethinking the institutions from within is something that is a task from all of us, I think. In fact, I think we believe that artists today can take a role of institution builders, and in that sense, the producers of new forms of economy, new forms of governance, and new forms of relation, let's say, to enable and increase those capacities of the bottom up. So the project that we are interested in is in a project of knowledge transference, let's say, from the bottom up to the top down, to push back upwards to transform institutions. And that, again, requires also a commitment to certain levels of longevity. I mean, I think that, once any of these projects that might be more activist and bottom up become institutions themselves, how do they sustain themselves? How do we produce a more committed project in the context of these vulnerable, at least in our case, populations? So while, again, it is a challenge of knowledge transference, we see it also as a transference of forms of management. I think the moment that we might unplug from the communities that we engage, I think there should be enough institutional trace left so that the communities can, in fact, begin to develop their own forms of sustainability.
And if I can just add, so Teddy's speaking about institutional accountability at a macro scale, but for us this really comes down to the kind of education we're promoting within the institution. If we teach a studio, for example, where we are asking artists to become, and cultural producers to become critical of their own motivations, their own audience, the time in which they're writing, the materiality of their projects in relation to very concrete urgencies and crises and challenges in the world. And oftentimes we get pushback. That production is an idiosyncratic kind of visceral kind of response to stimuli and psychology and so forth, and there's a place for that, but we believe that art education within the institution, within the university, can avail itself of the critical tools that the university makes available, and that those critical tools can then be mobilized for impact outside the institution.
Of kind of empowerment of having students, like, sort of bringing them in to teach almost right away. Like most of the community you work with their student, or your students end up taking that role sort of as part of them being a student, or as part of the residency. I think that's really interesting and so dramatically different from, say, what we see in like museum education or a lot of more traditional art education, even outside of the university, where it's like public education is this thing where there's like, there's an expert and like you're going to learn the most sort of basic knowledge so that you can have like a conversant, reasonably like, conversant ability with it. So I'm really curious about that in all of these presentations. But with that, I want these people want to sort of expand on that for one. But I also want to ask about your community or your sense of community. What is, so you're able to sort of offer this empowerment, but how are you finding people? Where are they coming from? Who's missing? Who would they be ideally?
Also make collaborations with local universities, right? So Florida International University, actually, their student body base takes our workshops as well. And it's actually a really interesting relationship that we've developed with them, because they have this view of the university as being this kind of formal place that can actually relate or can work with what they consider more maverick sort of ways of dealing with in informal education.
The program wants to connect all of these framework ideas and work with these communities, with the artists and the practitioners or researchers, educators that participate in the program, opening more possibilities of work. And it's also connected with the crisis, with the recession we're living. And this is what we're doing. But we are having this tension I mentioned before, like it's a huge gap, because formal education is based in programs 50, 60, some of them are almost 100 years old. So there's a huge gap between formal education, academic education in the university in Spain, and these very experimental, radical programs like the clinics in the museum.
Because we are exclusively a art-focused education model, this our thing, and at least I kind of come from the radical position that art can't be taught. I don't really think we treat each other as teachers or the people that are teaching. I mean, that's sort of a nominal role, but it's more like, all right, you put together the list of books and you show up a little bit before everybody else. But you're really just there to kind of help moderate a conversation, and everyone who's in the room has as much to give as anyone else. And if you don't want to be there and don't want to be involved, well, just don't come, because, or come and just be quiet. I think it's fine too. So I think it's much easier for us to think about like putting someone in that position very early on and not being that worried about credentials, because, I think if anyone's eager enough, they'll be fine. And the group will kind of work itself out. Just to say something a little more broadly about like what is the community that we actually deal with, I think echoing a point I've heard before, is the biggest thing we do to kind of expand the reach of like who comes to what we do is by who we have leading those things. So by not having a system where we have the same group of people leading courses every semester, or and being able to rotate people through and bring in new faces and new ideas, it perpetually kind of creates new communities that aren't necessarily expecting each other. So people who would come because so-and-so is doing something they're interested in, they come for that, and then they're more likely to come to something that they wouldn't have come to the next go around. And so you start to put people together who like didn't know that they were going to meet and fall in love and have something interesting to argue about.
The things that we've been really committed to is intervening. So we're urbanists, and we work at the scale of the city. And you know, we've learned from several examples. I mean, we're students of Antanas Mockus in Bogota. And Antanas understood that in order to change things in a city, to make cities better, it's not just simply about intervening physically or, you know, it's about changing hearts and minds of citizens and perceptions about things that are happening in the world. And to do that, like right now, I mean, we're living in a time and a context of extreme fear in our part of the world. And so it's about retooling and turning very quickly. So temporality for us means being able to shift on a dime and begin to focus on things that people are thinking about and people are worried about.
What I'm seeing is, and I just come myself a few days ago from a meeting of presidents of small colleges, and everybody agrees. I mean, these institutions are highly stressed. The model is not working. They're embedded in all forms of hierarchical systems that have no honest relationship with an equitable, fair exchange of either power or power of knowledge or access to knowledge. And in the end, you end up with these highly gilded certificates that are supposed to allow you to enter into some sort of meaningful commercial engagement. This is obviously not what education is. This is not the core of teaching and learning. And what you guys have put together are some really splendid examples of alternative approaches to this. And I'm just curious, what is the meta sort of thinking? Are there groups of you? Are there places where we can go and think about trying to empower these various models, these alternatives to structures that have been around, such that they can actually have a bottom-up support to become viable alternatives or viable new frontiers for the super essential generational transmission of knowledge and sort of collective circulation of ideas. So what's the meta organization, or how and where do these conversations take place, and how can we collectively make these models provide a alternative?
There is no meta-organization, and actually that would be a great idea if there was some kind of a loose umbrella, and hopefully conferences like this can provide the seed ideas for such things, right? But even if we don't have those institutions, and even if people don't want to like directly like inject funds into our institutions, all of these institutions enjoy like receiving like money from people who can afford to give us funds. But even if you don't want to do that, what's important is to putting pressure on existing educational institutions to recognize us, to work with us, to team up with us, to accept the kind of knowledges and scholarships that come out of us as legit, and accept our students and exchanges, and through that itself can give us a lot of can connect us basically together in a way also. If they accept us and work with us and legitimize us further, I think that's a great help. So put pressure on universities in your communities to reach out for us and work with us, even if not long term but short term.
I want to add one further thing, which is to say that I think barring, or as we try to get these larger institutional forums to work with us or to be parasitical towards them. Meanwhile, there are all these sort of iterative knowledge sharing moments like this one today, and like the fact that we have Teddy and Fauna here because they're doing workshops with ArtCenter and sort of finding different ways to have them sort of spread the word about what they're doing and then hear about all these other things. And I think it happens in those sort of smaller network ways too, which I think is pretty awesome. So with that, I want to thank everybody.